Memorial Day.
Happy Memorial Day holiday, Monday morning.
I appreciate you taking the time, but at least for me, having it be a day off made it very easy to work this in.
Very true, and they're increasingly rare anymore. So it's I was like, oh, that must be why my calendar was wide open on Monday.
Well, you were in Chicago. No, not Chicago. Where were you last week?
Where was I last week? Washington, D.C. Sorry.
That's right. So you have been a busy person. Just came back, huh?
Yeah, a little bit busy, but good. Busy is good.
Busy is good, especially for men who, well, you have a company. You're not self-employed per se, right?
I am, well, both. I have my own company and I work for myself. So yeah, both.
Okay. Well, here you go. First question is, how would you describe yourself in 1 minute?
Oh gosh, in 1 minute. It's interesting. I tend to get a lot of questions about my job title. When I was at Facebook, I just everybody pretty much titled themselves, and I hate boring corporate titles like, HR specialist 6. So I just made my title Builder of Awesome People. And then Builder of Awesome Managers, Builder of Awesome Engineers. It kind of changed depending on work that I was doing and who I was doing it for. But the title that I have now, because I'm self-employed, I can make up whatever one I want, is just Chief Builder of Awesome People. I hate when people call themselves a CEO of a company that has one person, because I'm also the janitor and the accountant and all of the other things. So I'm a self-employed consultant who has a lot of experience in building other companies' cultures. And I take what I learned from that process over the last 15 or so years to hopefully help other companies be able to be the best versions of themselves. So that's how I describe myself at work. Outside of work, I'm a Chicago loving and living Cubs fan, bourbon drinking, book reading nerd. So all of those things.
And by the way, if as CEO you're as good as janitor, being how clean the room is behind you, obviously you're doing a good job.
I try my best, though. I know that I do a lot of video from this room, so I will admit that I focus probably a little bit more on this room than.
Well, if you're wondering about the Santa Claus in the background, this is also not only my office at home, but we have a year-round Christmas station, so that explains the
fantastic
paraphernalia. Next question. What inspired you to write This Is Now Your Company, a Culture Carrier's Manifesto?
It's interesting. One of the things that I got to do over the years at Facebook, as the company got bigger and bigger, advertising clients and political figures and celebrities, like all different types of like really interesting people, wanted to come visit the office. And as those visits became more formal, especially when we were, hosting advertisers and really important people using Facebook public figures, they would, our presentation to them kind of got more formalized. It went from like a casual tour of the campus to, no, really, we'd love to not just talk business, but we'd also love to hear, how have you built this company? How have you built this culture, which, in the tech world, at least, and now increasingly everywhere, Facebook's internal company culture is something that gets a lot of coverage. And I was one of the main speakers that delivered that talk. And, I was just really talking about my experience working there and kind of how we thought about developing people and ownership and, fighting back against an entitlement mentality, which is pretty common in tech companies today. So just lots of different things that seemed pretty second nature to me because they were a part of my job. I noticed more and more that people that were visiting the office, when we did these talks, they would just be writing notes furiously. And these were like C-level executives from companies that most of us would recognize the names of. And I thought, that's interesting there. I just came in to talk about kind of what we do and how I do it and how I think about culture and how I think about managers' roles in culture. And it was clearly something that was resonating with very senior people. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And we weren't trying to claim that we'd invented it or that we had an exclusive on it. We were just, sharing this is kind of what we do and how we think about people and how we think about people in companies. And the more of those people kept writing that stuff down, a couple of them said, hey, have you written a book? And my response was no. And as I was getting ready to leave Facebook, that was one of the things that really became part of my post-Facebook plan was there's a really interesting story here that I was fortunate enough to be in a position to help write. And there's a usefulness and applicability of the things that we've learned and the things that we've done outside of the company. And so I wanted to kind of write all of that stuff down. Partially so that I would remember it. In many ways, it's a memento for me personally, but also because I think that there was just useful information that other companies could, and people within those companies could take and apply to their own work, regardless where they worked.
And I should note, so if you wonder why I stepped away, I wanted to throw this up there so people can see it. It's a beautiful book too. I have quite a few IT books now. Last year, I think, early middle, I'm not sure, that renewed interest in learning and reading. And this is a recent book I got. It's just beautiful. So I don't know how much extra it cost you to get it done like this, but very nicely done.
It really didn't. That's the funny thing. The designer did a phenomenal job on the cover. I really wanted it to be modeled after, if you do a Google search for Facebook posters, one of the things that Facebook is famous for is these big they almost look like propaganda posters that just say things like move fast and break things, or people, like all of our company values. And I wanted it to look like that. I wanted it to be very kind of aggressive lettering. But I also wanted the word you to stand out because the subject of the book is mostly, you. So the designer did a really beautiful job. The first thing that you see as an author while your book is being edited is all of the mock-ups and the ideas for the cover. And when she sent me that was the day that it was like, oh, this is a real thing. This is actually going to get published, which was exciting.
Well, nicely done. I don't care how it happened. This, folks, good on your bookshelf if anybody comes into your office.
Emily Rodvold, I will let her know that you love the cover.
Speaking of the book, in this book, you note that you're not fond of the word empowerment.
Yeah.
You're talking about empowering people to do certain things. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to decide if it's the word that I dislike or the way that it's applied. The reason that I kind of have an allergic reaction to the word empowerment is that it implies that there's a choice. When you tell people that they're empowered to speak up, for example, which was the topic of the Vital Smarts talk that I gave. When you tell people that you're empowering them to speak up, you're giving them a choice still, saying like, we will let you talk about things that are hard to talk about, for example. And I didn't want people to feel empowered to do anything when it came to, owning their role in our company and in the culture. I wanted them to feel required to speak up, or I wanted them to feel required to talk about problems. I wanted them to feel required to do the right thing all the time. So I think it's partially the intent of the person that's using it. A lot of times when people say, we empower you to do this, they're really not. And the reason they're choosing the word empower is that they want you to choose to not do anything with that power that they're giving to you. So I think it's one of those concepts that I think is fine if you take the definition of the word literally, and it's meant literally and it's interpreted literally. But unfortunately, I think a lot of times the people that are saying that they are empowering others really don't want them to use that power. And the people that are on the receiving end, whether they know it consciously or unconsciously, are like, thank you for that empowerment. I'm going to choose to do nothing with it. And when you're trying to grow a company of any size to any size, if you've got a lot of people who are empowered to do something, but nobody's actually required to do it, the likelihood is that they're going to choose to not do anything. And so I just don't like what it implies.
Well, it's interesting. I did a talk called Counterintuitive IT. How do you change culture, or how do we change culture?
Mhm.
for the Agile COI. And that's one of the things that I included. And part of the reason I included it is you've probably heard of John Shook with NUMMI, the Shook
Mhm.
change model.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how when they were talking, the GM wasn't really, they're like, are you really going to put an and-on cord in where anybody on the line can stop it? And Toyota said, yeah, we're going to. And it's not that they can stop it. We want to require them to stop it. And the two just hooked it. And I see those kind of motifs across DevOps, across business, where people say, no, actually, it has to be. So that's part of the reason I called it out. Is I do think, anybody listening to this is to be successful. I had a small department. To be successful, I can't be the only one who pulls the cord, right? I can't be the only one empowered to stop it. And if other people have that empowerment but don't do it, what good, right?
No good. And the interesting thing is, when a company is really small and everybody knows each other and everybody trusts each other, more or less, the likelihood is that empowerment is going to be enough, right? Because everybody knows each other, everybody trusts each other, and there's no assumption of ill intent, right? If you and I work together in a team of 10 and we all know each other, the likelihood is that if something is on fire, we're going to say pretty quickly, hey, that thing is on fire. It gets more complicated the bigger the organization gets, and people naturally kind of want to look to a smaller number of people to be the ones that are responsible for making sure that everything is running the way that it should. And the premise behind that part of the book is why. We all know, we've all worked in companies, or most of us have worked in companies that are really big, where everybody knows that there's something wrong and nobody's saying anything about it, even if they've been empowered to do so. So I just really wanted to kind of reinforce that using that language and that framework of empowerment versus requirement is one of the ways that companies with really good intentions produce really bad results.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next one. Maybe is there something else? I expect there'll be something else. What do you think is the single greatest impediment to effective management in IT? Is it different in a DevOps scenario?
I think I don't even know if this is exclusive to, I would guess it's not even exclusive to IT. I think the most damaging impediment to good management in general is just a lack of communication about how you're going to work together. And it never fails. It doesn't matter what company, what industry, what size of the company I'm in. I do a lot of work in the manager and leader development space. And one of the things that, as every company gets bigger and bigger, one of the things that they all kind of gravitate towards is, we should probably have some type of manager leadership expectations. And they spend a lot of time and energy to create the exact same lists that most people have created. Set clear goals, give people feedback, coach them, connect them with things that are going to help them develop their career, let them know when they're not doing well. Nothing rocket science. And then when I go around to any random manager in any organization and say, have you actually sat down with your employees and had a conversation, kind of expectation by expectation, how you're going to work together here? 99% of the time they'll say no. And then when I ask their employees, hey, this is what your company has said is expected of your manager, clear goals and feedback and all of that stuff. Have you sat down with your manager and initiated a conversation like, hey, can we talk about how we're going to work together, given that these are the expectations that the company and therefore I should have of you? And they look at me like I'm from outer space. Like, why would I do that? That's my manager's job. And so again, it kind of gets back to the last question about empowered versus required. You give these people these expectations that in many cases we don't really hold people accountable to anyway, but then they never talk about them. And so on the other end of that, when I've been in HR facing roles where, I'm dealing with issues where managers or employees are coming to me together or separately to say that their relationship isn't working, I'm like, great. So you're having an issue with feedback, for example. When you sat down and talked about how you were going to give each other feedback and how you were going to manage that process, what did you agree on? And again, they look at me like I'm from outer space. Like, why would we do that? Well, you would do that because not doing it is what got you into this mess. And it's a consistent issue across. I don't know why we don't do it. There's no other job. Like if you were hiring me to be an IT technician, for example, and you were going to be my manager, the likelihood that I would start that job and you and I would have no conversation about what was expected of me and what success would look like is almost zero. Like you'd have to be a really, really bad company and manager to not have expectations of me. But when we flip that and say, you know, I'm going to report to you, we should have a conversation about what that relationship is going to look like and how we're going to manage it. The vast majority of people don't do that. And again, it just kind of leads to a lot of assumptions. Whoever my last manager was, maybe in my last company, I'm just going to assume that you're going to be the same way, and I'm going to treat you the same way, and you're going to treat me like maybe an employee that I remind you of. And instead of actually building a relationship based on how you and I want to work together, we don't do that. We base it on pretty much everything but those things. And then we get really surprised when the relationships don't work out. So I don't think that that's something that is unique to or exclusive to any one profession, but I do think it's the most detrimental thing when you look at employee-manager relationships and therefore the ability of managers and management as a practice to be effective in any organization.
Okay, thank you. Now, I don't know about you. I'm sorry. So every time I do something where I talk left and right or count, I have to make sure I get the right number of fingers up and I actually raise the right arm. But when you presented in Denver,
yep,
you showed up on the screen. You said draw a line, and then on the left part of the line, I was probably showing to right to you.
yep,
You put actively part of the problem.
yep,
On the right, you put actively part of the solution.
yep.
Smack dab in the middle, neither part of the problem or part of the solution.
Yeah.
Can you explain why you said being in the middle, smack dab in the middle, was the worst?
Yeah, because people think that we tend to think in binaries and in absolutes. So I'm either a part of the problem or I'm a part of the solution. And I specifically started using that framework in teaching content around unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Because especially when you talk about things like race bias, for example, we tend to look at racial bias in terms of I'm either a racist, and depending on how you view racism, I view it as a terrible thing. You'll look at that and say, oh, you're a racist, active part of the problem. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we tend to think that not saying or doing racist things is the opposite of being a racist, and it's not. If you are an opposite end of that spectrum, you're actually fighting racism, you're calling it out, you're speaking about it, you're holding people accountable. But that's not what most people who don't see themselves as racist are doing. They're mostly comfortably in the middle saying like, well, I would never say or do anything like these bad people are doing, which is great. You shouldn't. That's basic table stakes. But if you want to be seen as somebody who's solving the problem, not contributing to it is not the same as solving it. And culturally, it's the same thing. When you talk about organizational behavior, I talked about it in terms of I hate passive aggressiveness. Yeah. And so if you look at the bad end of the spectrum, it's people that are actively being passive aggressive, not saying, not being direct, saying things to the wrong people. And then on the opposite end of that isn't not doing those things. It's actually calling those things out and saying like, hey, why are we scheduling 5 meetings here when one would suffice, right? Yep. But in being in the middle, not contributing to the problem or the solution, I'm actually really contributing to the problem. Because by being neutral and not doing anything at all, I'm kind of silently agreeing that whatever the status quo behavior is fine. And so it's been a really useful continuum to put in front of people especially when you're talking about things that are philosophical or thought-based. Because if you see yourself as a part of the solution, but you're really doing nothing, yeah, then you can't really claim that you're a part of the solution. And that message, that continuum is really meant to help those people who think that just by not contributing to the problem, that their responsibility is done. And it's a really compelling framework, I think, for a lot of people to see that and say, okay, yeah, I thought I was actually a part of the solution, but when I look at my actual behavior, all I'm doing is not contributing to the problem, which is not the same.
So it definitely had impact. One of the things that stood out to me, but during the talk, you made a point that it was dangerous because nobody is ever called out for apathy.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck with me. Nobody's ever called out for apathy. So there you are. I would even argue probably contributing to the problem because you're not doing anything to solve it, which, you know what I mean? But and nobody's going to call you out because you're not doing anything wrong. And obviously you're not sticking your neck out to solve it. So, but yeah, it definitely stuck with me.
It's that comfortable middle ground where people think that, say you don't like a political office holder, right? Yeah. There's obviously plenty of people that feel that way today. You can say, you could say, well, I didn't vote for that person. That's a famous, like, the bumper stickers, don't blame me. I didn't vote for that person. It's like, well, but who did you vote for? And if you really don't like what that person stands for, did you engage in conversations with other people who might be on the fence or might have been prone to vote for that person, but for your contribution to their understanding of the problem? No, my job is to just vote. And it's like, well, is it really? Because half of the population, for example, doesn't vote. So you could say, well, I voted, I got my sticker, and I can post a picture of myself on Instagram wearing my I voted sticker. But that's the bare minimum to me. Like, if you want an engaged political population, you can't just vote. You actually have to engage with people who disagree with you. You have to be willing to talk about issues and embrace the conflict of ideas. And for too many of us, we're like, well, as long as I voted, I did my part, which is, again, it's another slippery slope. Because if you say, well, all I have to do is vote, that's all that matters, we're all affected by the 50% or more of people who don't vote. And so if we say, well, I voted, I did my part, you really didn't, if the solution is we want every voice to be heard. So it's just it's a constant check mentally of, am I really doing what I think I'm doing, or am I just kind of doing the bare minimum? And in many cases, when people apply that kind of continuum, and I say, well, just apply it yourself. No judgment. You're going to be where you're going to be. You can't solve every problem. But just think, like, am I actively solving the problem? Am I actively contributing to it? Or am I just kind of sitting in the middle doing nothing? And a lot of times, and I include myself in this, what we find is we're actually sitting in the middle doing nothing, but believing that because we're not contributing to the problem, we must be solving it.
And by the way, you answered half of my next question.
Oh, cool.
So I'll ask you the other half, which is, what did you do? What was your responsibility at Facebook when it came to unconscious bias?
Bias in particular, it was actually one of those moments in my career where I had no idea in the long term what a short-term decision was gonna end up delivering for me. But I just got a call on, I think it was a Tuesday afternoon or a Wednesday afternoon, from Lori, the woman that ran HR at Facebook, and said, "Hey, we'd love for you to come meet with us and with Cheryl Sandberg, our COO. We want to rebuild our bias class." And so, very long story short, what originally started out as, hey, this might be a quick weekend project, still almost 5 years later is a significant part of the work that I do, which was specifically at Facebook building a program to really create an environment where we could talk about the fact that we all have biases, conscious and unconscious. And the interesting thing about that content was I've been in learning my whole career. Most learning experiences, training classes in particular, are, here's the topic and here are the 2 or 3 skills, framework skills, whatever we're going to teach you and give you. And then we'll give you some opportunity to practice using them. And then you go out into the world and put them into practice. And this was a very different program. And when I teach a version of that program today, one of the things that's interesting in working with clients is helping them kind of reframe their expectations of what a training program is meant to do. Because that program is, in and of itself, not going to solve or eradicate bias. It's not possible to do so. It's not going to elevate one type of bias over another per se and say, this is the worst one and everybody needs to work on this one. It was really meant to just create an environment where we could talk about what it looked like to have biases as human beings and to understand from a research perspective, peer-reviewed research, what does bias actually look like at scale in organizations, and putting that in front of people so that they could understand, like, hey, if we don't check for this stuff, if we don't acknowledge that we have it, the likelihood is that we are going to fall prey to it. Despite really good intentions, will produce really bad results. And you know, it's a metaphor for everything else, right? Like if the things that you're doing that you're not conscious of can sabotage you, especially if they're done by lots of people at scale. And so the point of that program was to really help people understand that despite having really good intentions with regards to things like diversity and inclusion, which most tech companies do, we really firmly believe that one of the reasons that we and lots of other companies were perpetually unable to get different results was not because we lacked good intentions or were bad people. It was because we didn't realize how much these systemic and structural biases play on all of us. And so it became an opportunity to really kind of bring that stuff to the surface so that we could talk about it.
Okay, well, so we've gone over the half an hour, and I try to respect time. So the last three questions I think are relatively quick, so I'll jump to them.
No, I still have coffee, so as long as I still have coffee, we're good.
Oh, well, if you don't mind, because I think these are things, obviously, the questions reflect a little bit of what jumped out at me, both in your presentation and book. So just raise your left, well, my dentist says, if you're feeling pain, raise your left hand. So when you're ready, okay, next question then, since you're being so kind.
No worries.
What is your advice? And you did technically talk to this with your passive aggressive stuff too, but what is your advice to people who are speaking to not Scott instead of Scott?
Yeah. So the premise of that is, it was based on my experiences where, as somebody who is really outspoken and is relatively unafraid to call things out, because I'm just like, hey, this is a problem. I'm not blaming you for it or think that it's necessarily your fault. I don't care about that. It's just a problem and we should talk about it. You build a reputation, and there are lots of people like me who are just good at that, right? We see a problem. We don't get super emotional about it. We just say, hey, there's a problem there. Let's talk about it. And one of the side effects of being one of those people is that invariably then people are like, oh, well, you know how to talk about it without becoming a mess about it. I'm going to come to you and vent about my problem, and maybe, you know, you'll solve it for me. Or I'll feel better about having vented, and then the problem will go away. And I, over time, came to call those not Scott conversations, Scott being the fictitious person that you are upset with, but instead of talking to Scott, you're talking to me. And I think anytime you feel that urge, or you see like, wow, I've talked about this issue that I have with this other person, we'll call him Scott, with 5 other people, and yet I still haven't managed to talk to Scott, that is a sign that you're having one of those moments where you're having all of the right conversations with all of the wrong people. And I think, as somebody who has been on the receiving, because I like solving problems, when people would come to me, be like, oh, Scott really pissed me off, and here's what happened, I'd be like, oh yeah, that sucks, we should do A, B, and C as a result of it. What I realized over time was, those people coming to me having that conversation were treating that as the conversation with the person that they really needed to have it with, and then not doing anything with it. So over time, I evolved my response, my approach to those conversations with, look, I'm happy to talk to you about whatever is bothering you about your relationship with Scott, but this is not a replacement for you having the conversation with him, and I'm not going to do it for you. So if this is venting, let's call it venting, and then you can go on your way, but make no mistake, you are not solving the problem with Scott by talking to me about it. And it was an important realization as a manager, because again, it was an example of like, I had really good intentions. I thought I was being a good boss by having these conversations with them. And what I realized over time was that people were using me as a stand-in instead. And so I just shifted. I didn't shut down those conversations, but I was very clear, like, I see what you're doing and it's fine as long as it's venting. Or if you want to just role play with me how to have a good conversation with Scott, and that's what this is, fantastic. But if it's just an avoidance tactic for you to get the like negative energy out of your system and then not solve the problem, the likelihood is it's going to recur.
It's funny, it didn't hit me until just now, and I'm glad I asked the question, that it's not just something that reflects back on the person having the conversation with not Scott. It actually reflects back on us as managers as being not Scott.
Right.
I'm somebody else that certain people feel comfortable talking to,
Yes, which is great.
Right, exactly. But as I noted to him, it's like, I can't answer that thing. You'll need to. I'm glad to support you. I can't force you to do it, but I think it's good. It's not just the person having the not Scott conversation. It's a person receiving the not Scott.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm obviously a huge fan of Marcus Buckingham. He wrote the foreword for my book, and he has written extensively on strengths. And one of the things that I'll never forget that Marcus said early on when we started working together was that a strength, a strength that is overused can become a weakness. And I think that that was a perfect example. Like, one of my strengths is that I present in a way that people feel very comfortable coming to me talking about really significant problems or challenges, which is great. And I'm good at hearing it, and I'm good at not getting super emotional about it, which is wonderful. And overused, if I don't, balance that strength with, and we got to talk about what are you going to do when you go have this conversation with Scott, then it actually becomes a weakness for me as a manager, because I am creating a false sense of security with the people who are having those conversations with me, that in some way, shape, or form, they're actually solving the problem, when you and I both know they're not. And so that was I included that in the book because as with every chapter, I really tried to think through, what did it look like when I didn't do this well, or when I thought I was doing this well, but it turned out I really wasn't? And what did I learn from that? And that not Scott conversation thing was one of my big eye-opening moments as a manager, for sure.
Okay, thank you. The next one was something I don't think you had in the book or in the presentation. I snuck this one in. I said, speaking of feedback,
yeah,
what do you think the best corporate approach to formal reviews and goals is? There's writings out there. I'm interested in your thoughts.
It's interesting. My point of view on an opinion of this has changed over time. My general belief is that the review systems in most companies are terrible and counterproductive and are a waste of time, energy, and actually have the opposite of their intended effect. And I say that not just from personal experience. I was reflecting when I left Facebook, one of the things that I asked from our HR team, I was like, could you just send me not all of my reviews, but every 6 months when we get our performance review, we would get like a summary sheet. It's called a comp letter. And it would just say, this was your level, this was your rating, this is, your bonus, salary change, anything that might have happened from a compensation perspective. But the key thing that I was looking for was, what were all of my performance ratings over time? And Facebook, like most companies, has a scale from like doesn't meet any expectations, which usually means you've already been fired, to what they call redefines expectations, which is something that you did was so completely beyond expectation that it actually changed the company or the product in some significant way. And in the middle is the meets all, which is, we have high expectations of you, you met them, congratulations, you get 100% of your bonus. Great. And the interesting thing was, and I think this is true at lots of companies, but certainly true in a company with a lot of overachievers, people looked at meets all as getting a C, because it was the middle, right? Instead of saying, well, meets all is actually an A, and anything above that is like an A+ or beyond, whatever that is. People had a really hard time with the notion that being in the middle of a very talented pool of people that are all working really hard and meeting lofty expectations was somehow being mediocre. And the interesting thing is, and I don't think this is any different in most companies, when you look at review systems, the vast majority of people, excuse me, are going to cluster in the middle.
Yep.
So the vast majority of people are going to meet their expectations. A decent number are going to exceed them. A smaller number are not going to meet them. And yet, even though we know in advance that the law of averages and large numbers, whatever you want to call it, is going to show that most people are in the middle if you've done a good job of hiring and training them, we spend all of this time and energy to confirm what we already basically know, which is that most people are generally meeting all of the expectations they have in front of them. A handful, a pocket of them are greatly exceeding them, and a handful or a pocket of them are failing to meet them. And yet we invest inordinate amounts of time and energy to prove that to ourselves every 6 months. Now, the interesting thing is when you ask employees in most companies, they'll say how much they hate performance reviews.
Yep.
But then when you're like, okay, well, we're going to take them away, they're like, no, not so fast.
Okay.
And it's kind of related to I think the second chapter or the third chapter in my book about organizational Stockholm syndrome. We have that with the review systems in our companies as well. They're not good for us. Even people that are really successful and do really well, the anxiety that they experience throughout the process, writing the review, hearing it, is not worth it in my view. It's just not worth it because I don't think that it produces the outcomes that organizations are really looking to produce. If you're looking for a performance review to really help people understand how they're doing, how their behavior is translating into results, that's just something that we should be doing on a regular basis, not saving it up for 6 months and then using it as an opportunity to justify a compensation action, which is a completely different requirement. So I think what they're intended to do and what they actually do, there's a pretty significant difference. And to get back to what I started talking about earlier, when I asked to see all of my reviews, I never got anything less than meeting expectations. And I got as high as a redefining expectations. And I can say in all honesty, within 2 weeks of any of those reviews, I felt exactly the same. Like I have more work to do. So, it really, I think companies that ask themselves, what are we trying to accomplish? What is it that we actually want this review system to do? And is it doing it? And is it doing it at a cost that's low enough to justify the effort? And I used to joke when I had Microsoft as a client, I wasn't subject to reviews because I was a consultant. But from the outside looking in, and I was joking, but I was kind of serious. It's like you all spend 8 months a year basically reviewing the other 4. Because with 2 cycles that each took about 4 months from beginning to end, all that left was 4 months where you weren't actually in some form of the performance review.
Yep.
It's a giant waste of resources. And again, to plug Marcus, because he's such a huge influence on my work, Marcus is absolutely anti-performance review. He just wrote a whole book. I actually have a copy of it right here because let's plug his book, which he graciously signed. The 9 Lies About Work, one of them is specifically about feedback, and the performance review system as a structured feedback mechanism is, I think he thinks, and a lot of other people think, is one of the old lies about work that we need to stop telling ourselves.
And by the way, because you had plugged it, I think you made a comment on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
His book. I'm reading it. I'm at I finished line number 2.
Yep.
And working on it, where line number 2 had to do with basically, I love this idea. People talk about span of control, how many people to report to. And basically they say the span of control that's right for you is a number of people that you can meet with at least once a week.
Yeah.
Because of that feedback again, that constant, and he says, contrary, part of the lie is contrary to what they say, it is not quality, it's quantity.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny too, because again, the opposite, the thing I love about Marcus and that I think I emulate in my work is just taking something that is generally, for whatever dumb reason, accepted as just common knowledge and saying, like, but that actually makes no sense. Like, it's the empowerment versus requirement. If you want 25,000 people to all take an active role in how they contribute to your company's culture, you can't empower them. It won't work because they won't. And we know that it won't. We have evidence that it won't. We have data that confirms that it won't. And yet, for some reason, I love that he called his book, The 9 Lies About Work, because we actually have to call them out. They are lies. They're just not true. And I love that he uses that provocative title to really get people to be like, oh, what? It's a lie? Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think that the lie about the performance review is a lie that we've been telling ourselves for a long time. Not that there's not value in feedback or talking about how people are doing or how that effort translates into results, but specifically the way that it is structured in a if you're spending 8 months out of 12 in a review process, you are wasting just inordinate amounts of energy and both mental and physical and emotional. And my take on that is you should find another way to do
Or just suggest this is that you and Marcus are kind of like Sherlock Holmes and we're Watson.
that.
And what I mean by that is Sherlock Holmes would say something and Watson would be, how can you say that? You know, and then Holmes would go step through step, say this, 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 this. And then Watson says, well, now it's obvious.
Right.
And I think in a lot of these things that a book like this, a book like Marcus's, that's why I've set up the term counterintuitive IT. There are things that actually, once you read about them, it's like, man, that does make sense. But up to that point, they seem counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And we really need, it's not just a lot of people writing great books out there, but the fact is we need those homes out there to explain the steps so that we watch, since now it is obvious and it's easier to support it too.
Yeah. And it's the same. I remember I was in London at the end of April, beginning of May, teaching the bias program to a group of employees at a company in London. And the thing that I notice the most is, and again, this is just brain chemistry, our brain likes patterns and it likes repeated patterns the most, because when a pattern repeats, our brain doesn't have to do any work. It's like, oh, I expected that. That's what happened. Fantastic. Let me move on with the other millions of calculations that I need to do right now. But I was specifically talking about how changing your environment has a significant impact on how you look at things that you would otherwise take for granted. And I used the example, again, of that lazy kind of autopilot brain. When you go to London, if you are coming from the US, two things happen. One is, when I'm in the US, I pay zero attention to thinking about what it is to be an American, because I'm just surrounded by them. Yep. I'm not an outlier, I'm not unique. Everybody, for the most part, is American. So I don't think a lot about it because I don't have to, I don't stand out. I think about it constantly when I'm in London. Like, am I standing on the right side of the escalator? Am I saying words that make sense? Am I using that word correctly? Am I putting a U in where I normally wouldn't? Like, I'm conscious of those things because I'm aware of the fact that I am in an environment where I'm not the norm or the standard. And I was trying to help people understand how this relates to bias. And so fortunately, if you pay attention to these things, the universe will just give you examples. And as I was walking into the office from the hotel, one of the things, if you've been to London, that you'll notice is, if you are in a heavily trafficked by tourists area, they will paint look left and look right on the sidewalk, so that, because you have to look the opposite direction that your brain would normally tend to look for traffic. And so I asked people, I'm like, do you notice the look light? And they're like, oh yeah, it's there, but like, I don't pay any attention to it. Like, because you don't need to. Your brain is automatically wired to look in the right direction because that's what you're used to. Mine is not. And I've almost gotten creamed by I don't know how many buses because I forgot to look. And I said, but the other thing that I want you to pay attention to is they don't put look left and look right in residential areas because tourists don't go there. And so they don't need to get you to kind of shake yourself out of your comfort zone if it's fine to be in that comfort zone where you are. And I think the same thing applies to stuff like, I mean, the thing that I loved about Marcus's work in particular from early on, his first book was called First Break All the Rules. What the world's leading managers do differently. And it's the same thing. It's like the only difference between empowerment and ownership is just the word, right? Like, what we're trying to get people to do is the same thing. We want them to take ownership. We want them to be responsible. We want them to be thoughtful of the impact that their behavior has. And the only difference is somebody else will say empowerment and I will say requirement. And it is a word change that has a profound difference on the outcome. And so those are the things that I look for in my work is, what are the subtle shifts? What are the things that I've not paid any attention to that if I just noticed a little bit more of, I could have profoundly different results? And that's why the book is kind of subdivided into, what does that look like for me as a member of a team, of a company? What does it look like for me interpersonally with managers and peers? But mostly, what does it look like just noticing and paying attention to my own behavior in a little bit different way? So the theme runs throughout.
Great call. It's interesting because there's another guy I enjoy, Michael Hyatt. He does books on making better use of your time. And this year, see if the rest of the books fall. If you hear big crash, that means I pulled out one too many books. And but
Yep.
you got free to focus. And one of the things I talk about being efficient is to make those simple things just habits, so you don't have to think about it.
Yep.
But it hit me as you were talking. Well, we have to be cautious, right? We can make habits. We become more effective. We get things done the way we want it. And then we're missing the fact that one of our habits is actually not that useful, not if we think it. So definitely a good book too, but
or completely sabotaging us. Like that's the other thing with years of teaching this bias content. The people that were, consistently picking a resume with a white sounding name over a black sounding name, including people of color, they didn't realize that they were doing it because the habit that they had was something that formed unconsciously over years. And so, we have these habits and these mindsets and these beliefs, and I think beliefs are habits in many ways. And that's what we were saying earlier about being willing to jump in and actually question those habits, or even just notice that you have them. The thing that I tell people coming out of the bias program, for example, is if you do nothing else in the next week or two, I just want you to see things, either see them a little bit differently than you've seen them before, because now you have more information, or just notice things. It's a coaching technique that I do with my coaching clients is, we'll start and somebody will say, I really need to get better at my executive presence, which, we'll tease apart what that actually looks like. And then they immediately expect that the next thing is going to be, okay, well then if you want to get better at executive presence, you have to do A, B, C, and D. And a good coach, somebody that's actually trying to help you improve, won't do that. They will say, well, I would love for you to spend the next week or two in moments where you feel like you're not having the presence that you want, to just ask yourself, what's holding you back? Like, notice what is going on in the room. Is it the people in the room that hold you back from doing it? Is it the subject that they're talking about? Is it the severity of the stakes? Like, what is it that's actually a barrier to you having that presence that you want? And I don't want you to do anything differently over the next 2 weeks, but just notice what are those environmental factors. And the next conversation that you'll have 2 weeks later, people will be blown away. Like their minds will just be blown because they've noticed things that were there the whole time that they just weren't looking for before. Or that they didn't realize factored in. And so the other part, you'll notice at the end of every chapter of my book, I don't say, if you want to get better at feedback, do these 5 things. At the end of every chapter is, I want you to think through what have you done historically when this type of situation has happened? And what would you do hypothetically if this type of situation happened? And they're all questions. None of it is, here's the answers to how to get better at giving feedback or having a good relationship. Yeah, it's
good. People prove that what you do.
Yes, but that's a coaching technique. Yeah. I don't know what the answer is to your specific issue with your manager, but I have a pretty good sense of what some of the questions that you could ask yourself about that situation might be for you to learn more and just to get more out of what you already know. And I think it's a slight but significant twist on how do people learn and grow. And I believe that most people are smart. Most people know a lot more than they realize, but they don't necessarily know how to access that information that they already have access to. So the book and all of the talks that I've done, whether it's with the Crucial Conversations talk with Vital Smarts or others, the point of that is just to hold that mirror up to people and say, there's a lot that you already have. Let's figure out how to get more, extract more out of what you already know versus telling you, a whole new, instead of, saying, here's the new 9 truths about work. Let's just call out the 9 lies that we're already telling ourselves and look at those situations differently. So I think that the premise is similar, but I'm totally, the next time I talk to Marcus, going to tell him that we are both Sherlock Holmes.
I honestly think it's a fair and by the way, Goldbrat speaks to it too. He talks, I love that he comments about the emotion of the inventor, but his point basically is that the best way is, because he's then, how do you give people the emotion of the inventor? And he talks about the Socratic Method. Yeah. You ask them questions and let them derive the answer, even if you do know the answer, right? And if you look at the goal, the guy knew the answer, but he wouldn't tell the hero of the book what to do. Same thing Gene Kim does in the Phoenix Project. So.
Yeah, it's especially important, and this is all really top of mind for me because I'm 2 weeks away from finishing my executive coaching certification, and it's been
Congratulations.
a year process. Thank you. It's been a ton of work, a lot of learning. I thought I was a really good coach before, and I wasn't. I was a really good advisor. So again, people coming to me saying, here's what I'm dealing with, I was really good at saying, oh, I've done that before. Do this, do this, do this, on your way. And what coaches do is the exact opposite. So tell me more about this problem. How did you get there? What does it feel like to be in that situation? How are you? It's just such a different approach and it's also liberating for somebody like me who likes to be able to solve problems quickly. One of the things that comes with that is when you don't know the answer, it can be really frustrating.
Yep. And
you might be tempted to give people an answer that is half-baked instead of really thinking through. And coaching is the exact opposite. It's, okay, let's slow down and pick this apart a little bit and understand the current state before we get to the future state. But that's just through questions. And especially if you do know the answer, it's especially important to ask questions, because you knowing the answer to somebody else's problem is probably not going to be as useful as you helping them figure out what the answer is to their own problem. And then they'll have that in their back pocket for the rest of
it. When you're not there. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, well, I'm going to skip one question because we've definitely gone over, and I know your coffee may still be warm. You may even have one of those cups that heats itself. But the next three should hopefully be quick. Last three. Have you learned anything since you wrote the book you wish you could add?
Have I learned anything? Oh, of course. Specifically, what we were just talking about with regards to coaching.
Okay.
I think I would add a lot more about the importance of asking questions. I'm glad, intuitively, it just kind of naturally occurred to me that I didn't, and actually it was my publisher, because I was like, what if I completely screw people up and give them the wrong advice? She's like, well, why would you give them advice? You're just sharing your perspective,
Yep.
You're sharing your experience. And I'm like, but I have to give them something. I can't just okay, and that's all I have to say about feedback, let's move on. That's where the mirror moments, the move to action moments came from, was I want to give people something, but I don't know who's reading the book. So, but instead of giving them answers, if I could give them really good questions, that would actually be more valuable. So I would have put, I think, more on the importance of that. And yeah, so maybe for volume 2.
That's it, second edition. And I'll expect that, I'll pay, but I'll expect a signed copy of
Done.
Yeah. Okay, second to last question.
Yep.
And it can only be one. Mick he balked. He didn't want to just say one. You only can choose one.
Right.
If you could only recommend one other book for people to read other than yours, what would it be and why?
Oh, God. Crucial Conversations. For sure. And of course you have a copy of it. Because I think there is so much evidence out there of a lack of skill in this. I mean, when you look at, I come from Facebook, right? Facebook is, I just saw an article this morning, or a comment on an opinion article, that, Facebook is spreading all of this false information. It's like, well, people are actually spreading that false information. Facebook doesn't create content and then share it for you. And it's that separation of everything is happening to me versus I am a participant, whether I'm a conscious participant or not. And one of the things that Crucial helps you do is really own, what is my role in the problem that I'm dealing with? And how do I take that and combined with intent and a healthy ability to separate fact from fiction, so that I can actually have effective conversations. And the funny thing is, a lot of people assume Crucial Conversations is about feedback or arguments or fights. It really is mostly about you and the emotional triggers that send you down a spiral of storytelling about what's happening in the world around you and how to get a better handle on that. And there is just so much evidence that is such a needed skill for so many people today. And I've read the book probably 5 times. I've taught the class for 15 years.
Okay.
And I still am not perfect at it. I never will be. So with all of that practice and all of that exposure to it, the fact that I'm still working on it to me shows how hard it is to master and how important it is to keep working at it.
Thank you. Okay, final question.
Yep.
And by the way, I agree. I lucked out. It was actually, I was trying out this book club, and one of the two first books, it was a book club by Michael Hyatt. One of the first two books in the test thing was Crucial Conversations. And I was so convinced that I immediately, within the company that I work for, they actually have trained trainers too, who are certified trainers. Yep. And I immediately had it for my class and offered it to some other people, and the response was universally positive. So yeah, good choice.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Easy last question, hopefully. Any final thoughts you would like to share?
Oh gosh, that's broad. I mean, I think again that the principle, the common thread in all of the books that we've talked about, kind of all of the theories that we've talked about, is that ownership. And I think when I see people who are frustrated and who are lashing out, and whether it's at work or outside of work, online or offline, the sense that I get in so many cases is what they're actually lashing out about, what they're actually upset about, is a perceived lack of control. And you know, we have so much control over things that we explain away as being owned by other people. It's especially frustrating when I see people at work that are like, oh, I have this terrible relationship with my manager, with my peer. And the first question is like, well, what's happened when you've talked about that issue? I haven't done it.
Talked about what, right?
Yeah, exactly. Talked about what? I'm like, well, have you talked about the fact that you don't get along? Have you talked about the fact that you don't trust each other? Have you talked about the fact that you don't have clear expectations? And the answer to that question is almost always, honestly, no. Maybe I've hinted at it, or I've alluded to it, or I've talked to, not Scott about it. And the reason that Crucial was such an easy recommendation for like the one book that people have to read is that it's that gap between what you want and what you're getting is usually only one or two conversations away. But you have to be willing to own your role in it. You have to be willing to own, like, yeah, our relationship has sucked for the last couple of years, but to be honest, I haven't really done anything to fix it either. And it's important, like, for us to have a good relationship. So I'd really like to talk about that with you. That's not hard to do in the terms of just saying it out loud, but it's not the conversation that's actually the hard work. It's all of the hard work to understand, why have I let this go on for 2 years? I write about a woman in the chapter on feedback that had an issue that had been going on with her mother-in-law for 20 plus years. And it was a simple misunderstanding that completely changed the trajectory of this woman's life. And all it was one misunderstanding said at the wrong time. And 20 years later, they finally dealt with it. That conversation was in her control the whole time. And she just chose, whether she was conscious of it or not, to do nothing about it. And so the common denominator in everything that I do work-wise and personally is I hopefully just try and connect people with what they actually have control over and reflect back to them with some tough love in a lot of cases. Like, you're actually a part of the problem, which is great because you can choose not to be a part of the problem and instead choose to be a part of the solution, and you'll probably get vastly different results. And helping people make those connections actually makes it easier for me to make those connections in my own life, my own career. So that's the overarching message, I think, of all of this is, there are lots of things that we can't control, but there's a lot of things that we can. And if we focus on the things that we can control, we'll probably get drastically different results.
Great thoughts. Well, thank you again for taking time. I know it's early. Well, actually, no, you're in Chicago, right?
I'm in Chicago, so
it's in the other direction. I have, so my company's main headquarters, main headquarters, but also most of the companies out in California. I know when you were with Facebook, I'm actually, just so you know, I was born in Joliet, Illinois. I didn't spend time there. I did go through boot camp. Great Lakes.
Nice.
But I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you have some good plans for the rest of the day.
No, my plan is to do nothing. I actually have to teach a class tomorrow morning, but it's for the first time ever, I think it's actually here in Chicago. So I don't have to get on an airplane. I'm home for another week, which is great. But yeah, I'll be teaching a class tomorrow here in Chicago, and the rest of the week is pretty open, which is lovely. Take them when I can get them.
Thanks again.